All right, here we are. And today we're going to be talking about the forerunners of modern dance. It is these people who gave us a foundation for modern dance as it grew and developed in the United States. But before we get to the forerunners, we have to talk about really what dance was like at the turn of the century. Dance in America prior to 1900 sort of mirrors the nation's exploration of its own frontier and pioneer spirit. Vaudeville had really risen to popularity in the United States, which was a series of variety shows and extravaganzas in the music halls that were sometimes a rough and tumble kind of affair. They were really an extension of the saloon environment. And then again, that was on the American side, but then also in Europe, from the European stages, classical ballet was emerging with stories of fairy tales. Dance was formulaic, with a rigid set of required steps and poses. Sleeping Beauty, The Nutcracker, these classical ballets, they featured extra characters such as like Puss in Boots or the Bluebirds or dances from exotic cultures. So they had this notion of the exotic other, and they really featured these things in the ballets that were seen as fanciful, which is really rather offensive in many ways, now in hindsight. And several of these ballets came from Europe and toured across the United States. They were European ballet stars that came across and performed on the American stages. Here is a sign of vaudeville entertainment. Some of these dancing girls from the vaudeville stage, and images of sort of the saloon environment. You notice the raucous crowd, the entertaining barmaids. I think this man is shooting a gun in the background. The dancer, before coming on stage, didn't even put down her bottle. Again, saloon. It's really a saloon environment. I think there's a empty bottle. There's a bottle right here on the stage. This is the kind of environment people were performing on. I think this may be I'm not sure if he's a dancer or if he's just a saloon goer. It's kind of a raucous affair. And then if we look over here to the European stage, we see fairy tales and classical performers. They have moved on point. They're wearing, let's go back, let's look at the corsets. Look at the corset that she's wearing. So stiff, tough to move. The tutu, the little wings, trying to be ethereal, lighter than air. And then huge stages that were set and established with backdrops and this very formulaic style of dance. All around the country, at the turn of the century, the United States was undergoing huge political and social changes. President William McKinley was assassinated in 1901. He had gone to a World's Fair and was shot at close point blank range in the belly, and later died. About 8 days later, he died of complications. So the President of the United States has been shot. A few years later, the Wright brothers take their flight on the sand dunes of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. 1912, you have the unsinkable Titanic, which hits an iceberg and sinks to the bottom of the ocean. During this time, the Model T is coming out, Panama Canal is being built, World War I, so the world is in chaos, mechanical machines and machine guns and trench warfare. It's decimating and just senseless war. Prohibition comes out in 1919, and the women's right to vote. August 18th, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, and on November 2nd of that year, more than 8 million women across the United States voted in elections for the first time. So, major changes were undergoing during this time. And because of that, a new vision of dance really emerged around the turn of the century. Now, this term new dance was used to describe the developing art form because the term modern dance had not yet been coined. But this new dance form, it was really a synthesis of many different people's contributions. And today we're going to look at these 5: Francois Delsarte, Emile Dalcroze, Rudolph Von Laban, Isadora Duncan, and Loie Fuller. We're going to look at these dancers and what their contribution was to this developing art form. Now, these new dancers, they wanted to be authentic. They performed barefoot rather than on point. They wanted to dance about real people, about real situations, things that mattered to them, not just fairy tales of princes and princesses. So they abandoned tutus and tights that were worn on stage, and they got rid of the everyday floor-length skirts with petticoats and confining corsets, and they started wearing soft, flowing dresses or Greek chiffon, and they allowed things that allowed their body freedom of movement. And they danced with scarves that left movement trails in the air, and these were rebels of their time. They were part of the avant-garde. And the avant-garde movement really is a military term. It refers to troops who are at the head of the battle, like the lead in a battle formation. And in art, this really refers to the artists and the people who are out in front, pushing the envelope in whatever their respective field is. We have writers, painters, musicians, and dancers who are experimental and innovative in their art and their design. And in the early 1900s, really an artistic revolutionary army invaded the dance field. Their intention was not to innovate and refresh the art form, but rather to tear it down, to tear down the old ballet regime and to create new forms of dance. Their new ideas were contemporary and individualistic. This new breed of dancers remained outside of ballet companies in order to express the spirit of their times. In dance, they explored really their torso, the middle of the body, where waves of movement could start. The use of the bare foot and swinging motions of the whole body. The treatment of space as three-dimensional, and the importance of ideas and feelings in movement. Individual freedom was important to these dancers. Modern dancers not only rejected ballet, but they also claimed the freedom to be different from one another. And every major modern dancer was then to go on and create a special technique to train other dancers for his or her company. They spurred the restraints of a traditional ready-made dance forms and the dictatorship of established ballet companies. They just left that behind. But modern dance really didn't have a common goal either. It was rather the combined contribution of self-willed, dynamic dancers who were each possessed by strong inner drives and visions. The artists, I've listed a few of them here: Isadora Duncan, Ruth St. Denis, Ted Shawn, Martha Graham, Doris Humphrey, Charles Weidman, Mary Vigman, Hanya Holm, Merce Cunningham, Owen Nicolai. We're going to get into all of these and many more. The artists, they created a succession of these varied personal movements and styles, and each founded their own school and company, and each was really a star performer and choreographer and company director. Each would attract pupils and a separate audience and would spurn the others. So they all had their own sense of tradition. In common, they all looked on classical ballet as sterile and restrictive and not relative to the needs of the 20th century audiences, and they were interested in expressing their own spirit of the age. New, challenging attitudes towards the world, towards behavior, towards the body. Artists of any age sense that their times are ripe for a new way of looking at things, and through their art, they get their audiences to see the world differently. And the 20th century was a time of new ideas of nationalism, communism, socialism, ideas of freedom, equality, equal rights, and the women's right to vote. So dance, the art of the body, and of behavior, well, it could not help but be affected by all of these ideas and ideals that were swirling around in this time. Tradition and creativity. Just a comment about that. Modern dancers were creative, but they were somewhat traditional too. In what sense did they really cling to their own tradition? They created traditions by trotting new paths and the interest of freshness in life. And they often looked to the past for traditions, like back to the Greek era. Ballet fans, looking at this developing modern dance form, criticized modern dance for being distorted, ugly, and amateurish. For a long time, the dance world was really divided into these two camps, each wanting to drive the other one out and to hold on to the field alone. But as we look back, we can now see that both sides really won. Ballet has absorbed many of the teachings of modern dance, and choreographers and performers who consider themselves modern dancers accept classical ballet as a really important part of their training. We can now speak of Western concert dance, and that continually is fed from both ballet and from modern dance. And so it really comes from both streams of thought continuously. So, moving on to these forerunners. Francois Delsarte. He was a singer at the Paris Opera until he lost his voice due to really bad training, and this led him to search out for a method of conveying feelings and ideas from the stage to the audience through the body. He spent days on end in the parks around Paris, observing people. He developed charts and graphs of their gestures. He watched families sitting in the park having picnics. It became a science to him to look at the gestures and the body language of people. And he created graphs and charts for the expression of these ideas, and he recognized that gestures were really the outward actions of inner states of the human psyche. So his work just caught on like wildfire in Europe and quickly spread across the Atlantic to the United States. His method influenced Isadora Duncan, Ruth St. Denis, Ted Shawn, and their students, and Doris Humphrey, one of them. Doris Humphrey's book about choreography, which is largely used in colleges and universities even still to today. It's largely based on these principles of three. See, he believed in this universal formula of trinities. He saw the Trinity not as just, the Trinity we think of most commonly as the Christian idea of, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. But he saw this as a divine pattern in all of life and expressed detailed variations of the theme. Like all of creation, he saw trinities: man, life, soul, mind. That life is just a mix of these trinities, and he sees them everywhere. Just the body, you have the head, the torso, and the legs. From space, you have near space, front space, back space. Movement can be done, and he sums up all of movement in three ways: opposition, parallelism, succession. So you're going to move against something or with something or in line with something. So people took this information and they ran with it. They saw threes as just a way of developing movement and a great way of moving forward, and they choreographed based on these ideas. Emile Dalcroze, Emile Jaques Dalcroze, he was not a direct pupil of Delsarte, because Delsarte died when Dalcroze was about 6 years old, but Dalcroze learned of Delsarte's theories and he incorporated them into his work. Musicians today are really indebted to Dalcroze's system of rhythmic analysis and for the effective method that he used for teaching it. He created something called eurythmics, which is really a physical method for understanding music. A physical, full-bodied dance method for understanding music. In eurythmics, students are taught how to respond to musical phrases with the body. They move their body on command and let the music command how they move. Gestures in this theory represent different time values in the music. And unlike Delsarte, Dalcroze really had no interest in the emotional possibilities of movement. Really, in fact, he laughed at Marie Rambert, of the Rambert Ballet, who went on to form the Rambert Ballet. She was one of his students, and he laughed at her because he laughed at her and he criticized her for being too balletic in her movements, and he provoked her into shouting arguments by insisting that there's no such thing as the art of dance, independent from music. It was kind of his theory. Music was central to everything he did, and movement. So his primary interest was really in visualizing music in the body. Yeah. And that was where he was primarily interested. Then we come to the work of Rudolph Von Laban, who was really the founding father of a European expressionistic dance. He was an Austro-Hungarian dance artist and theorist. He was a dancer, a choreographer, but he's most known for his development of movement analysis and Laban notation. These theories continue to this day, and they give a language to movement, and it's a really wonderful, nuanced and in-depth language. Corey, my wife, is a certified movement analyst, which has taken Rudolph von Laban's theories and she uses it practically. So those of you that are taking her movement analysis class, you're in for a treat this term. So here we go. So Rudolph von Laban, he was the founding father of European expressionistic dance, and his interests, he was originally interested in painting and architecture. He studied dance in Paris and eventually established a choreographic institute in Zurich, Switzerland, and scaled this up and later founded branches of this in Italy and in France. He wrote books on his analysis of human movement and practical applications for his theories applied in not just the arts but also in industry. His system for recording all forms of human motion had a great impact around Europe, all across Europe, and his ideas spread and influenced the work of many dance artists like Mary Wigman and Kurt Jooss. His theories really did give language to movement ideas. And he developed this Laban movement analysis and Laban notation. Laban was also the first to establish community dance, and he set out to reform the role of dance education by emphasizing his belief that dance should be made for anyone and everyone. So those are some of the ideas that we have about surrounding Rudolph von Laban. And this image is really a great one because it shows some of his gestures, the chart. The way music has a staff and it moves across, and there are symbols for recognizing, and a whole language, a written language for illustrating what musical notes that musicians should perform. Well, Laban's theories created the similar shapes and a written language, a notation for the moving body. And so that's what we see these symbols are behind Laban here. And here is an illustration of what some of those look like. You'll notice that the staff, so the movement goes and flows in a direction. So from the bottom of the staff flows upward in terms of time. And if you could read the symbols, you could know what is going on. So you could find out and understand. And so dance happens and moves in a very similar way. This way, we could take a whole dance, choreographed performance, and illustrate what's going on the stage in these bars of action. And it tells you what happens. It's very specific and very nuanced. Here's a quote that I'd like to read. Existence is movement. Action is movement. Existence is defined by the rhythm of forces of nature in balance. It is our appreciation for dance that allows us to see clearly the rhythms of nature and to take natural rhythm to a plane of well-organized art and culture. That's Laban right there choreographing his movement, one of his movement choruses. He became known for these movement choruses. And we need to talk about Isadora Duncan. Well, have you ever danced to music simply for its own pleasure? Moving about freely in response to the feelings that you get from the music, or perhaps from your own deeply felt emotions, just to move? I have. If you've done this, then you've really shared in the legacy of Isadora Duncan. Just yesterday, I was dancing in the living room with my sons. I have several small boys, and it was just freedom, and that kind of dance just in the living room. If you've ever done that, then you've really shared in Isadora Duncan's legacy. Back around the turn of the century, clothing was responsible for much illness in the late 1800s there. Women's long skirts dragged the floor everywhere they went, and they couldn't help but get dirty. And their corsets were tight-fitting and uncomfortable, and they restricted breathing. Now imagine having asthma and walking across town in a corset and in a big, heavy dress that dragged around the ground everywhere you went. Bathrooms, city streets, puddles, mud, dust. Women were campaigning for health reform, including fresh air, improved hygiene, and for more simple public clothing. And Isadora Duncan rebelled against the corset. She threw off the restraining clothes and sterile cliches that bound dance and she made herself a symbol of the powerful new vision of expressive movement. She stood for natural dance, for the education of children in order to build a free society, and for the dignity of men and women, and for the unfettered movement of the body, and for free love. In 1900, America was just not ready for her. So she shocked audiences with her see-through costumes, and so she had to leave. She left for Europe and found a home there. She was politically active, and she openly expressed admiration for the Soviet state. She made long-winded speeches, and she would step up to the footlights and wave a red scarf in support of the Soviet cause. Isadora Duncan. This is an image of her that I just feel like expresses a lot of her sense and sensibility. She was born in San Francisco, and she was the fourth child of a music teacher and the man who was absent. He had been a banker and was accused of forgery and left Isadora's mother when she was pregnant with Isadora, so she didn't have a father who was around. And from her mom, she absorbed a love of music, philosophy, humanistic atheism, and a bias against marriage. She swore she would never get married. And although she was not anti-romance or anti-men in any way, like she had many romantic sexual affairs, 2 unmarried pregnancies, constant distractions about about love, but and she did end up getting married, but she was always off onto a different tangent. She was distracted by the recent Soviet revolution, and she was part of her identity. I would say was really about dancing for mankind. Like she was politically active. And from a young age, she believed in herself as a natural-born dancer and as a free spirit. So she wasn't classically trained, but just moved because she loved to move. And she did develop a technique. So her family took her to Europe to seek support for her style of dancing, and she gave recitals at private parties and a few public concerts in Germany and Hungary and London and Paris. And just Paris loved this young girl. She made a huge impression on the art world there, and people constantly painted and sketched and made statues of her, and she inspired a craze of barefoot dancing that just swept across Europe and even across America. Her influences were, her approach to dance was completely personal. So she took the rhythms and shapes of the trees and the wind. She always danced to great music, like piano pieces by Chopin and Beethoven, and she was inspired by Greek art. She visited Greece several times and sought to keep the ruins of the ancient Greek temples as a constant source of her inspiration. She lived, you see there, until 1927. And there's really no footage of her dancing except for one small clip taken of her, a point of view from someone with a video camera from behind a tree. And we just end up seeing a little bit of her in this video. But Isadora opened lots of dance schools across Germany with her sister Elizabeth. But, Isadora Duncan was just too distracted to keep in one place for too long. So she lacked the discipline to stay in one place, to develop a school. So she left schools in the hands of other teachers so she could go off and tour and perform. In 1921, when she was 43 years old, she opened a school in Moscow. And she married a moody Russian poet there, but the marriage really didn't last long. In 1922, she toured to Boston and angered the crowd by saying that her art was symbolic of the freedom of women and the emancipation of New England Puritanism. She told them that she did not appeal to the lower instincts of mankind like your chorus girls do. So she was rallying really there against vaudeville and saying she was different. She wore a red scarf. She waved to the crowd. She said, "This is red," meaning Soviet, basically. "This is red, and so am I. The color of life, the color of vigor." And then she ripped the tunic to expose a bare breast. And she said, "This is beauty." She was a rebel. And the last years of her life were really sad. Her children drowned in a car accident. She was divorced. She raked up the bills, drinking, searching for enough money to start another school. The ones in Germany and Moscow failed. America didn't know what to do with her. But her death is legendary. And before I tell you about that, I have to also mention that she loved children and really wanted children. She wanted to teach children the freedom of movement and to raise them in ways that allowed for them to just freely express their creativity. She adopted several children, and they were called her Isadorables. And but like I said, she never stayed around with them too long. She kept going with her performances, and her death is really legendary. So she got into a glamorous convertible sports car with a friend and tossed a long scarf around her shoulders, and she said to her friends, "Farewell, friends, I go to glory." And the car started, and the scarf caught in the wheel of the car and broke her neck. So quite the famous death of her. And she's buried in France. So let's go on to from Isadora Duncan. We also have her contemporary, Loie Fuller. Loie, like Isadora, had no formal training or education in dance, and her movements were open and free. And she clothed herself, you see, in these billowing, soft, gauzy fabrics with bare feet or sandaled feet, but they were often bare. This is an image of Toulouse-Lautrec, and there were several images of her as well, and sculptures. Well, Loie Fuller formed a company of of girls she called the Muses, after Isadora and the Greeks. In 1902, she and Isadora Duncan actually had a joint tour, but Isadora didn't stick around. Isadora left after a few performances. Now, one of the things that Loie Fuller is known for is her theatrical effects. Yeah, so she made several new inventions and discoveries and, inventions, and made a lot of headway in terms of theatrical effects like lighting design. So she claimed to be reviewing dance and as an art form that could be traced back thousands of years, but her interest and talent really lay in the expressions and rituals of dance. Like, she made a tremendous impression with her dances that featured flamboyant circling of fabric that extended outward from her arms as extensions of herself and of her movement. The actions of the dances were placed under this colored spotlight and a light stand of footlights that just changed colors. At the time, gas lights were most often used, and skirt dancers that would come near sometimes would actually catch their skirts on fire. These gas lights would sometimes catch their lights on fire, but she used lights that helped to change colors on the stage. There's a film of her that I've linked to that shows a lot of these colored lights and the changing of the fabric, changing colors of the fabric. So there's footage by Louis Lemaire, who was experimenting with a moving image. It was called the Serpentine, and each and every frame is hand painted in the film of Loie Fuller. So take a look at the images in the videos that I've linked. So in America, she found very little. America found very little interest in her aesthetic. Sorry about that. Here we go. Yeah, so here's just some imagery of her. But America didn't embrace this as much as they did in France. In Paris, they loved her. And sculptors and artists like Rodin. Here's a Rodin sculpture of her. Rodin called Loie Fuller a genius for the work that she did. This is an image of her. I mean, she used the fabric to create images like butterflies, and there were many, many imitators of her style. One in America was Annabelle the dancer, who worked with Thomas Edison. Edison was developing the kinetoscope, which was a moving, like the beginnings of the moving picture, the moving camera, and he captured images of Annabelle as she copied Loie Fuller's style. And so dance and the moving image, dance and the camera have a long history together. So we see images like this, and we recognize there's a long history of modern dance that was just getting started. And these were the experimenters. These were the members of the avant-garde who really pushed themselves forward, and their ideas of these forerunners, moved on into and permeated into the work of all of the dancers that came after them. And some of that work is still being done today. So it's really good to know who these forerunners are. Thank you so much for today.